Baste and machine the two parts of the sleeve together along the short seam. It is very important, of course, that you make two mirror images with the right sides together. It doesn't wholly need to be pasted, but it's what I'd suggest to make it easier. It needs to be back tacked at the top of the sleeve, but we can leave it at the bottom. It is sewn with the ever-present 1 cm seam allowance. To iron open the seam, lay the undersleeve flat and the top sleeve will rumple and stuff. Just iron the seam open like that. It's important to do with the undersleeve flat for some reason. We can apply fusing to the buttonholes on the cuff to make it easier to sew. On the wrong side of the cuff on the top sleeve, yes, the top sleeve there, mark 1 cm from the mark stitches. Apply a 4 by 12-ish centimeter rectangle of fusing along those points and press it down onto where the buttonholes are going to be. Lay the bottom of the sleeve onto some silecia on the bias to reinforce the cuff without compromising the flexibility too much. Trace either side a little above the hem and above the top of the cuff. Cut it out. Make sure that the cuff of the sleeve is flat, wrong side up, and lay the silecia onto the sleeve as you cut it. I'm basting the silecia down to one of the seam allowances through everything here. I'm going to machine it to the other seam allowance. Here I'm also cutting a section of the silecia away from the top of the seam allowance so that it has a greater range of movement. I'm moving the top sleeve out of the way and using the baste to keep the silecia in position so that I can very quickly and easily machine stitch to fasten the silecia before removing the baste. We need to do another baste to hold the silecia down to the sleeve along the top of the silecia. Make sure the silecia is flat and doesn't pull anything, which is helped by the fact that we cut it slightly on the bias. Here I am copying the mark stitches onto the inside of the sleeve, including the seam allowance and the tops of the vent. Last stitch for now is attaching the bottom of the silecia to the hem inlay. I want the stitch to be at least 3 cm from the hem mark stitches, and the two pieces of fabric need to be staggered so that they aren't too bulky. This will be covered by lining, but I still like to prick stitch it down. That said, a wide machine stitch does the trick as well, I've recently found. Now I need to press the cuff into position. So firstly, I want to mark 1 centimeter into the sleeve from the mark stitches on the top sleeve. Then I mark the width of the button stand onto the undersleeve. It needs to be shorter than the inlay that you have on the top sleeve, so I chalk 3.5 centimeters from the mark stitches onto the inlay. The same on the other sleeve. On the top sleeve, I want to press the chalk line that I made. You might avoid basting this line first, or take it out immediately after. You want to press the seam to a little above the inlay, pressing the undersleeve along the chalk line on the button stand as well. Before pressing the hem, we need to check it. Mark the top of the vent clearly and line the folded edge of the top sleeve to the mark stitches of the undersleeve, aligning the tops of the vent. Mark the hem of the undersleeve slightly higher so that the button stand doesn't peek out from under the top sleeve. Blend this into the hem. We'll fold up the hem and press it in place. On the top sleeve, fold it into a triangle and press it in place. This will be another mitered corner because the lining will sit away from the fold, so that we don't have to sew buttonholes through the lining. Baste it there, like the jacket vents, shaping it to point inwards. Baste along the top and move to the other side of the sleeve to prevent it from showing. Here I'm securing the thread to the stand to fell it down, then cross-stitching the raw edge to the silecia. On the mitered corner, secure the thread at the top and begin to fell the triangle. Usually we prick stitch a half moon shape around where the button and buttonhole is going to go to allow a button and buttonhole to be there. This is when the buttons start quite close to the hem, but I start mine quite far, so I don't care to do that. Remove the hem basting and you could press it again, as it'll be difficult to do later. Similarly, you could prepare the buttonholes, as in machine the perimeter of the buttonholes at this stage, although sometimes I take this opportunity to sew the buttonholes as well. You should have the measurements for each of your armholes. We can check which sleeve is which by folding the sleeve along the seam we made right side out and place it with the undersleeve on the bottom. With the inlays on the outside and the crowns facing you, you have your left on your left and right on the right. You want the sleeve measurements to be 10% larger than the armhole. If it isn't, then you can use the inlay you gave the undersleeve to move the line increasing or decreasing as appropriate. Moving the top of the armhole on the inlay 1 centimeter towards the raw edge of the sleeve seems to increase the size of the armhole by approximately exactly 1 centimeter, and vice versa. Changing the top of the seam and re-chalking the run of the hindarm seam and the armhole, double checking that the armhole is now the desired length. chalking the new runs onto both sides of the sleeve. To put the sleeve seams together, we need to mark the top of the vent onto the top sleeve on the inside of the silecia. Line up the tops of the vent and the top sleeve to the mark stitches or chalk of the undersleeve. Begin to baste the two together from the top. Tack the baste just above the vent. No need to bother starting a new baste, but come out to the outside and baste the vent down along the edge, the folded edge of the top sleeve 1 cm from the mark stitches on the undersleeve. Last baste, the cuffs should be able to sit flat together, but unfold the top sleeve onto the button stand on the undersleeve and baste them together below the vent. Mark the top of the vent across the stand on the top sleeve, and mark where the edge of the stand is on that line. Starting at the cuff, back tack onto the edge of the stand on the top sleeve and machine to the top of the vent, making sure that the edge of the stand is still folded. Turn the sleeve in the machine and machine towards the top sleeve, sewing it with a 1 cm seam allowance, back tacking at the top. On the other, starting at the top of the sleeve, back tack again to start. Getting to the top of the vent, back tack again, turning the sleeve in the machine to sew to the edge of the stand, back tacking for a third and last time. Press the seam flat. Stretch the inlay a little bit above where the vent finishes and press it open on a sleeve board. However, the inlay around the vent needs to twist, so gradually twist it to a little below the elbow and make sure it is properly flattened. In the sample, I think I cut the inlay to the seam allowance, which is still a very viable option. Double check that the chalk on the sleeve lining denoting the inlay is still present and marked on both sleeves. Ideally, we need it marked onto the right sides of the sleeves. Mark a point around where the top of the vent is going to be, a few centimeters above it, but realistically not too much because it's going to be felled together later. Join the shorter seam with pins and then a 1 cm seam allowance. As always, we need mirror images. I have the snip I made in the sleeve when I cut them so that I can line the pairs up properly. Machining the forearm seam, back tack at the armhole, but there's no need to back tack at the hem. Pressing the seam flat first. I need to line up the top sleeve seam to the hindarm seam inlay. We don't want the sleeve to drag, so basically make sure the weft of the linings are parallel between both sleeves, which is basically how we should always work. We need to mark on the top of the cuff vent as well. Machine down to a bit above the top of the vent, with the usual 1 cm seam allowance from the top sleeve. I'm back tacking a little above the top of the vent and then machining down a little further, which is secure, but then it will also be easy to remove a little bit later if I need to. Press the seam flat, and then press the seam over to one side, either with a sleeve board or by folding it over. I prefer not to split the seam allowances on the lining because I'm told it makes them weaker. Plus, folding it over slightly creates a tiny pleat all the way up the seam, which I just kinda like. To attach the lining to the sleeve, lay the sleeve down, undersleeve side up, and lay the lining undersleeve side down onto the sleeve. Always undersleeve to undersleeve. I find this works best, but doing it a consistent way around will make you less prone to mistakes as well. Lay them together with the lining 2 cm above the sleeve at the armhole. Depending on how you cut the lining in the first place, the hems may be flush, or you'll have 1 to 5 cm of lining beyond the cuff. We'll baste the seam allowances together starting 10 cm down. I am taking the seam allowance of the lining and unfolding it out from under the sleeve. Then I'm unfolding the seam that is the furthest from the lining onto the lining's seam allowance, so in this case the top sleeves, sewing those two together. Start with the forearm seam, which is the shorter seam. Moor the basting thread, binding the seam allowances, moving down a few centimeters and basically tacking through the seam allowances again. Between each tack I don't want the basting to be tight, I just kind of keep it loose between each one. Finish the bastes just above the silecia. Use a pin through the lining's seam allowance to the silecia to keep the lining centered on the cuff. Best practice, lining up the seams of the sleeve to the sleeve lining. Do the same for the hindarm seam allowances, except no pin, just stop a little above the vent. Do your final stitch through the twisting piece of the cuff. This final tack in the baste will also hold the cuff together, as well as holding the lining to the sleeve. To line the vent, fold the cuff inlay over the undersleeve and baste it to the undersleeve inlay. Not all the way down though, as we'll need to turn the hammer up. Make sure you fold it such that the lining is pulled snug. This is why we put in the pin, so that we can fold away the majority of the excess lining. To fold out the sleeve, put your hand through the lining, take hold of the cuff and pull it through the sleeve lining. Remove the pin and reattach it in the same place from the outside. On the still loose piece of lining inlay, mark the top of the vent. Cut into it, ideally at an angle from the hem, and fold the lining inwards. You could also cut away some of the excess lining. More detail in the sleeve cuff sample video. The sleeve won't have a ballast, but you might like to mark 2 cm up from the edge of the cuff. At the folds, baste it in place to the lining, then to the top sleeve, not all the way down. Fold the lining up and baste around the edge. Like I said, not like the jacket. We're going to baste right along the hem this time to fill along the said edge. Turn it right side out. We can place 2 pins lining up the seams of the jacket to the lining so that we can cut the lining down to 2 centimeters beyond the fabric, if you happen to have excess at this stage. If it is necessary, don't cut through the stitching, as we don't want it to unravel. You can then remark the inlay on the sleeve's armhole. You can do a running stitch on the inlay so that it's easier to see from both sides when joining it to the jacket, if you like.